Mrs. Happy Catholic here, seeking to bring you authenticity, perspective, and connectedness. Welcome. Hello, everyone, and welcome to my channel. I'm Mrs. Happy Catholic, and today I have on a new friend, David, who consented to do a video with me kind of talking about Protestantism and Catholicism and traditionalism and how those kind of compare. And so just from his experience and doing a little analysis, and I know he's been getting ready for this video for a few weeks, and I'm excited to hear what he has to share, and also a little bit about your story, David, and how you came to be Catholic.
Yeah. All right. So, long story short, I was born and raised evangelical. My grandparents actually were Catholic and left in roughly 65, and then became evangelical and became very anti-Catholic evangelicals. So I was raised in this whole vein of Catholicism is absolutely horrible. The Catholic Church is terrible. If you're Catholic, you're going to hell. Then I got kicked out of a Protestant church. I started going to an Anglican church, which then ended up becoming part of the Ordinariate. And through lots of just reading the Bible, I discovered that the Catholic Church is actually true. So I'm probably one of the few converts to the Catholic Church from sola scriptura.
Oh my gosh, that's so interesting. Cool. Well, we're glad to have you.
Yep. Okay, so
should we start out by kind of defining terms? You proposed that was a good way to begin, so people know where we're coming from. Cool.
Yes, I agree. So the first thing we have to establish is what does it actually mean to be Catholic? Just because if we're going to define what is Protestant, what is traditionalist, we need good understandings of all of those. All right, so Lumen Gentium, section 8, paragraph 2 defines Catholicism as this. This is the one church of Christ, in which the creed is professed as one holy, Catholic, and apostolic, which our Savior, after his resurrection, commissioned Peter to shepherd, and him and the other apostles to extend with direct authority, which he erected for all ages as the pillar mainstay of the truth. This church, constituted and organized in the world as a society, subsists in the Catholic Church, which is governed by the successor of Peter. I'm going to read that part again. By the successor of Peter and his bishops in communion with him. Although many elements of sanctification and of truth are found outside its visible structure, these elements, as gifts belong to the Church of Christ, are forces impelling towards Catholic unity. So, to define what is Catholic according to Lumen Gentium, it is being under the successor of Peter and his bishops.
Okay.
The reason it's important to emphasize Peter and his bishops, the successor of Peter and his bishops, is because it's what Christ established. It is the church, it is the bride of Christ. Going on from that, in John 21:17, that's where Jesus establishes the church, and he says the famous, "The gates of hell will not prevail against it," or gates of the netherworld. You are Peter, and upon this rock will I build my church, and the gates of the netherworld or hell, depending on the translation, shall not prevail against it. This is important because this establishes the area of safety that we can have within the Catholic Church. And again, I will get back to like how this relates to what Protestantism is. But by establishing this and establishing the papacy really is the linchpin of our beliefs as Catholics. Because, and I'll explain why in just a moment, because that is the church which Christ established, and that is being under the church which Christ established. It's so much so that Vatican I actually said to deny that verse, and also this other verse in John 21:17, he said to him a third time, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? Peter was distressed that he had said this a third time, do you love me? And he said, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. Jesus said to him, feed my sheep. And then Vatican I says, if you deny this, let him be anathema. So this whole idea of denying the papacy and denying that Peter is the Pope or was the first Pope, and denying the succession of that, you're anathema. And that's not a good thing. I have a few other things to point out. Like, the Pope is the supreme authority of the Catholic Church. He is the vicar of Christ. And now the Pope is supremely important. Pope Pius X said in his encyclical, and I'm going to butcher this one, I'm sorry, Pascendi Dominici Gregis, his encyclical on modernism. It's actually really interesting because one thing I've noticed with a lot of traditionalists is they'll quote Pius X and they'll quote this document, and then they'll forget about this opening part right here. The office divinely committed to us of feeding the Lord's flock has especially this duty assigned to it by Christ, namely to guard with the greatest vigilance the deposit of faith delivered to the saints, rejecting the profane novelties of the world and oppositions of knowledge falsely so called. There has never been a time when this watchfulness of the supreme pastor, the Pope, was not necessary to the Catholic body. For owing to the effort of the enemy of the human race, there has never been lacking men speaking perverse things, vain talkers and seducers, erring and driving into error. Still, it must be confessed that the number of enemies of the cross of Christ has in these last days increased exceedingly, who are striving by arts entirely new and full of subtlety to destroy the vital energy of the church, and if they can, to overthrow utterly Christ's kingdom itself. Wherefore, we must no longer be silent, lest we should seem to fail in our most sacred duty, and lest the kindness that, in the hope of wiser counsels, we have hitherto shown them, should be attributed to forgetfulness of our office. The reason I'm bringing that up is because when we hear this talk of the modernists have taken over the church and the Mass is a Protestant Mass, what we're forgetting about is this thing that the Pope is needed, that the document on modernism states that the Pope is needed. So then the question then becomes, is the Pope actually the Pope, or is he just some false prophet? That's the question that we have to then understand. That's the question we're asking. Again, back to the whole Vatican I document. It says, for in the Apostolic See, the Catholic religion has always been preserved, unblemished, and sacred doctrine been held in honor. Actually, there's a whole section on Vatican in this one. I was going to get to it a little bit later, but I'm going to go here since this is a proper point. Vatican I says, so the fathers of the Fourth Council of Constantinople, following the footsteps of their predecessors, published this solemn profession of faith. The first condition of salvation is to maintain the rule of true faith, and since that saying of our Lord Jesus Christ, you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, cannot fail of its effect. The words spoken are confirmed by their consequences, for in the Apostolic See, the Catholic religion has always been preserved unblemished, and sacred doctrine been held in honor. Since it is our earnest desire to be in no way separated from this faith and doctrine, we hope that we may desire to remain in that one communion with the Apostolic See, which the Apostolic See preaches. For in it is the whole and true strength of the Christian religion. What is more, with the approval of the Second Council of Lyons, the Greeks made the following profession. The Holy Roman Church possesses the supreme and full primacy and principality over the whole Catholic Church. She truly and humbly acknowledges that she received this from the Lord himself in Blessed Peter, the prince and chief of the apostles, whose successor the Roman pontiff is, together with the fullness of power, and since before all others she has the duty of defending the truth of the faith. So if any questions arise concerning the faith, it is by her judgment that they must be settled. I'm dyslexic, so reading's very hard for me, so I apologize.
Oh my gosh, David, I'm so sorry.
It's okay.
You're doing fine, though.
Then there is the definition of the Council of Florence. The Roman pontiff is the true vicar of Christ, the head of the whole church, and by the father and teacher of all Christians. And the father and teacher of all Christians. And to him was committed in Blessed Peter by our Lord Jesus Christ the full power of tending, ruling, and governing the whole church.
Wow. Yeah, you kind of have to have him, huh?
Yes. And that's important because in order for us to understand what Protestantism is, we now have this understanding of, at least a rough understanding of the papacy. I'm not going to admit that I have a doctorate in the papacy or anything along those lines. This is just a rough sketch as to why the importance of the papacy is there. It is these sayings right here. So Constantinople, Lyons, and Florence. All of these are very important documents because they all come prior to Trent. The reason that's significant is because Trent happened after the Protestant Reformation. So, what were the Protestants protesting? They were protesting a lot of things. There were plenty of abuses that were happening in the church, specifically with indulgences. That was a big one that really upset Martin Luther.
Mm-hmm.
But what were they ultimately protesting? And that was, they were protesting the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. They were protesting the Holy Pontiff.
Yeah.
So when we look and start comparing modern traditionalism to this old Protestant Reformation, we see they're actually very similar in that they're both protesting the pontiff. They're both protesting the Holy See. They're both protesting the Vatican. A lot of them are protesting Vatican II. They're saying Vatican II is an error. So there's a big issue with that. The issue is, if Vatican II is an error, then what about all of these sayings from Vatican I? Like, for in the Apostolic See, the Catholic religion has been preserved, unblemished, and sacred doctrine been held in honor. Because the Holy See confirmed all of the documents of Vatican II.
Right.
St. Pope Paul VI, his name is on all of those documents.
Right.
So either the Holy See has failed, or they're not bad. They're good. They are of the church. That's the questioning that we have to then ask ourselves. Is the Holy See in union with Christ or not? If we're going to say not, then we then have to backtrack really far and then actually have to prove that Jesus was truly Jesus and that he truly did establish the church. And then what does that actually mean? And then we get into the whole evangelicalism. And here's the funniest part. I've seen people like Johnny Mack, actually, when I was a Protestant, John MacArthur, by the way, he's a big name Protestant. I was actually just listening to a evangelical podcast recently, just listening to them just to see what they were saying. And one of the things was that they were all saying is they were part of the church, part of the one church. All of them. Every single one of them said they were part of the church. But what does that mean? The Protestant understanding of being part of the church is not that Peter is the rock upon which the church is built, but rather Peter is a rock, and we are all rocks that the church is built on.
I just thought it was interesting what you're saying, that traditionalists tend to, they get this very Protestant ecclesiology of thinking that the church, the true church, consists in the body of believers, like whoever holds the true faith. So it's this intangible, invisible thing. And that's where Sedevacantists go, is saying, well, what would you rather have, the true faith or a visible church? Like, you can't have both at this time anyway, because of the state of the church. And it's really like, that's such a weird dichotomy. Like, that's not of divine origin. And it's totally inconsistent with Catholic teaching, because the church is a juridical structure. It's not just this amorphous cloud of believers floating around. Yeah. So I see where you're going with this. I think that's really good. Sorry.
Yep. Yeah, that's exactly where I'm going with it. Because, again, it's like, okay, so what is the church? Is it just a bunch of group of believers, like as you said? Or is it an actual structure developed by God himself? That's the question. And for the whole Sedevacantist position, the Sedevacantist, I technically was a Sedevacantist for most of my life.
Interesting.
Yeah, because the evangelicals, they don't believe in the chair of St. Peter. There is no pope. The pope was just some guy who was leading some heretic church in Rome somewhere. I was a Sedevacantist.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Yeah, and that was something like that just hit me the other, like, a while back, was that I was a Sedevacantist. It was like, it was something I never actually like connected the two dots, that I was a Sedevacantist, but I was. Because if Rome has fallen from the faith, which is what I believed, and then the guy who's sitting in the chair of St. Peter, there is no chair of St. Peter. Thus, the chair of St. Peter is empty. Because how can you have a chair that's, how can you, yeah, I don't know. There was just no chair. There was no chair. And so there was no belief in the Pope. But instead, what we come to is sola scriptura. Now, here's something I've also noticed that's been going along in this traditionalist movement is, which actually, I like your definition of traditionalism, which was that it's the people who are rejecting Vatican II on. I could make the argument going back to Vatican, the old Catholics, but for the sake of this discussion, we'll just say people who are rejecting Vatican II on. What these traditionalists are doing is interesting because they're saying they have this source of tradition. Now, getting back to the whole Protestant thing, Protestants looked at this, and as much as I don't like Martin Luther and what he did, I have to give him credit where credit's due. He denied the teaching authority of the church, meaning, well, the teaching authority of the church of his day. Let me rephrase that. But then, what about the teaching authority behind that? What about the teaching authority before that? So he was like, well, if this teaching authority is wrong, what else is wrong? And so he, again, credit where credit's due, like he at least was intellectually honest. And he was like, there has to be one thing that we can actually base our beliefs on. That one thing he decided was sola scriptura. Because again, if the Pope is wrong, and if the Pope can be in error, why can't the previous Pope be in error?
Right. It's just kind of, you run into difficulty there because like you have the Bible because the Catholic Church Council of Jerusalem gave us the Bible. So it's like, well, at some point you have to acknowledge the church handed you what you take your faith from. But yeah, it is, at least he was more consistent, was willing to go back farther, because today it's so weird. It's like these groups, they just pick a Pope. Oh, he was fine. Everybody after him was nuts. And different groups pick different popes. And so you're like, oh, well, this is so haywire. It's so chaotic. Like, how do I know which one of you to follow? And again, without the visibility of the church, you can't really be certain that the one church is the one church.
Yep. And if you can't be certain that the one church is the one church, what ends up happening is evangelicalism. Because the evangelical church did not just appear with their rock bands and stuff like that. And I've literally seen light shows at evangelical churches, okay? We did not get there overnight. It took us about 500 years to get there. And when you actually look at the history of the 500 years, it was first there was a denial of the Eucharist. And then there was a denial of like even the need for the sacrifice. And then it was like, well, if that's not that important, then preaching isn't that important. And then it became like this cross between preaching and music were the important things, and so on and so forth. And that's where we got to where we got in the evangelical community. But then there's, it doesn't make sense anymore. It doesn't, like, but that's the thing, is like, when you first take away the centrality of the Eucharist, you then fall down to everything else.
Yeah.
What gives us the Eucharist? It is the church. I'm going to defer to John Solza on the jurisdiction arguments. He's much more educated on that than myself, but he made a good point about how groups like the SSPX don't have valid masses. They do have valid masses. They don't have legitimate masses. They're valid, not licit. And again, I'm deferring to his expertise on that side. But the centrality of all of that is all tied together. We need the Pope, we need the Mass, we need all of that to be the church. It's not, and it's not just this one thing that makes us the church. Because if there's one, like, the certain celebration of the Mass is what makes us Catholic, then what about the Eastern Catholic churches? I'm not talking about the Eastern Orthodox who are in Schism. I'm talking about the Eastern Orthodox who are in communion with Rome. What about their celebrations?
Right.
Are they
But that's
invalid?
something that's come up with people that I've interviewed where they've said, like, growing up in traditionalism, they didn't even know about the Eastern rites because everything that was hammered into them was about 1962 Missal versus the Novus Ordo. And this is the only way to worship. It's the Mass of all time. And so then when they, grow up and they're looking around and realizing there's all these other rites within the church that have their own liturgies derived from the apostles, they're like, well, what the heck? Like, this doesn't make sense. Now your argument totally falls apart that this is the one expression or the one true, perfect, legitimate, immutable expression of liturgy. And so, yeah, you can't make the liturgy your rule of faith. Like, it expresses our faith, but not in its complete entirety in every iota of detail. Like, you can't even, no, there's no way.
Yep. Also, a shout out to St. Pope John Paul II. I personally attribute his work as to what brought me into the church. Because I believe it was in 88, he established this, I forget what the document was, but he allowed Anglican churches to come into Rome and still maintain their Anglican masses, which I personally attribute that to the groundwork that Benedict was able to do when he established the personal ordinariate of the Chair of St. Peter, which is how I came into the church.
That's great.
And so anyway, so again, I attribute it to him. He did something interesting. He allowed for the Anglican use Mass to be said. So I say that's interesting because with the whole argument that the 62 is more valid, more licit, more whatever you want to say than the Novus Ordo, and let's just say, for example, the Novus Ordo is a Protestant Mass. For the sake of this discussion, let's go with that. All right. What makes it Protestant? What was the difference in 88 or I'm going to say 88 until proven otherwise, 88, when JP2 allowed the Anglicans to use their liturgy? What was the key core difference? Because that was a Protestant Mass that was being used. But there was a key core difference. The key core difference is they were under Rome. They had valid orders and were under Rome. That's important because with the quote unquote Protestant Novus Ordo, let's just say it is entirely Protestant. Entirely. Does that mean it's illicit? If we have valid orders, valid form, is that Protestant? If it's under Rome, under the See of St. Peter, is that Protestant? Can that be Protestant?
You could say that if you believe that it was, a Protestant, formation of the liturgy, you could say that before it was officially promulgated as a concept, it was a Protestant like style. But once it was officially promulgated by the church, that makes it Catholic.
Yep. Yeah, it does. And that's the thing. And that's why I wanted to establish this whole idea of like, what is the Catholic Church? What is the papacy? Why these are important? Because then we could say that the Novus Ordo was a Protestant creation prior to being adopted by the Vatican. But even if it was, which it wasn't, but even if it was entirely Protestant, it loses that Protestant identity once it becomes Catholic and once it falls under the Holy See and the Holy See. Because that is what makes something Catholic. It's not this whole idea of like just the bells and whistles and stuff like that.
Yeah, does it remind you in some way of the Protestant church down the street and how they operate on Sunday? Therefore, it's Protestant, not Catholic, and it's not sufficient for our attendance, our belief.
Yeah, and here's another problem with that argument. When I was a Protestant, I would say the Our Father. Does that make the Our Father Protestant?
It was Catholic first. Well, that's the thing, is the Protestants, they re-adopted some of the early church practices before the Catholic Church worked those into the Reform again, because some of them had fallen out of memory or use and historical knowledge. And so when that came along the pike and the church was like, we want the liturgy to be the most authentically, Catholic as it can be according to its earliest celebration, and these things are worthy, let's put them back in. And so that makes them Catholic. They've always been Catholic. So the Protestants wouldn't be here if it weren't for the Catholic Church. So everything they have, unless it's something they completely just fabricated that has no relation to Christianity as it's historically been, everything is basically Catholic in origin.
Yep. It's something I've been thinking a lot about because, I've been watching these guys on YouTube. I'm not going to mention their names, but I'm watching these guys on YouTube and just seeing like their numbers growing and seeing like all this, and I'm like, this isn't good. I'm like, this is what I lived. I lived this all out. Like I've seen the end result of this whole rejection of Rome. I've been there. Like, coincidentally enough, back in my Protestant days, there's a little bit of a clarification there, but that's a story for a different day. Back in my Protestant days, actually, I'll just tell you right now, my baptism was not valid because I was baptized in Jesus' name only by a Protestant. Yeah. Yep.
That's a bad day to realize that.
Yep. Yeah, no, I found that out on a Sunday, went to a church on Monday, got baptized and confirmed on Wednesday.
Wow.
Yep. Anyway, so this was early on in my Catholic life where I still wasn't fully convinced that the Catholic Church was entirely what it is, because it's taken me 11 years to get to where I am today. But back when I first started in the Catholic Church, prior to me finding out my baptism was invalid, I skipped Mass one Sunday because I was dating a girl, a Protestant, and we went to her church. And again, I've been baptized since then, so all this is cleared. But anyway, so I skipped Mass and went to church with her on Sunday. And it was really interesting because they said the Apostles' Creed. They had, because this was during Advent, they had Advent candles out, which for evangelical church to have Advent candles out, and they did not have the set readings like that Rome has approved, but they had a set list of readings that they were going to go through, and they were going through Old Testament, Psalm, New Testament, Gospel. It was really interesting. So it's like, it's almost like the evangelicals are at their end game now, if that makes sense. They're like, they've gone so far away that they're realizing that they're this close to like realizing they need to come right back. And actually there are actually a lot of evangelicals who are coming back. And one of my neighbors actually, he is an evangelical, and he created a liturgy just for his Baptist church. And yes, you heard that right. Baptist church.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's interesting. It's like, it's interesting. I'm wondering what's happening. Like, I'm wondering, because during the Protestant Reformation, that's when Our Lady of Guadalupe showed up in Mexico. So I'm wondering if there's going to be something big happening with the evangelicals soon. I'm hoping, cautiously optimistic that something big is going to happen with the evangelicals soon. Maybe that's just wishful thinking, but
that's awesome.
But again, it's looking like they're being primed for it. But again, that brings me back to the whole point of like, what is Catholic? Traditionalism needs to look to the evangelicals and see what's going on with the evangelicals. I say that because what they'll find is it's not good. It's a shrinking church. It's very legalistic. It's a lot of things. But I say they need to look to it because they need to see what 500 years without Rome is actually like, where they're going to end up in 500 years. Look at the long game. We did it for them.
Wow.
Sorry. It just gets me sad thinking about it. Like, seeing, like, because I lived to the south. I saw what it's like outside of Rome. I know it's not fun. It's not a great environment.
They're losing their vitality. It's so sad. I mean, it's like the body's been dismembered and the parts that are cut off from the living core shrivel up and die. And that's what you're seeing. And it is so sad. And it's unnecessary. But I hope that what you're also seeing is true, that they could be coming back around to a place of reunion, maybe getting past all the water under the bridge and the abuses they originally were revolting against, and things having sort of been attended to. And maybe they don't have the same prejudice that the Protestants of 1500s did. Like, when we talk about a Protestant today versus a Protestant of 500 years ago, there's been so much time that they're not the same thing. Like, they're in protest against the church, but not really actively, many of them today, because this is just the way of life they've inherited. And so they're just living it out according to what they know, me and Jesus, and whatever that looks like, and doing their best because they've gotten so far away, they don't understand what they're missing. So if they can now discover that and be open to it, because maybe there isn't so much fresh angst, then I think that's very hopeful, very cool. I'm just afraid, though, I see traditionalism, it seems to be ripe with this very, it's like this very active rebellion, unrest, and vitriol against the church in a lot of cases. And so it's like, ooh, what we're seeing seething away under the surface of their nice, externals is probably very much like what was going on in the Protestant revolt time. And so we've come away from that enough, it's settled out, but now we're seeing it happen again.
It's interesting you mention and you bring up the whole externals. That was something very big growing up, were the externals. there's something like that I've noticed with a lot of like your interviewees, like of your ex-SSPX interviewees, that a lot of them have said things like they came from families where they were very strict and abusive, or if they didn't come from it, they witnessed it. That is something I've seen honestly firsthand. I'm just gonna put this out there for the whole world. My dad was very emotionally abusive, but from an external standpoint, it looked good. There were 10 of us, and it looked good. It looked very, we all dressed properly and all of that, and very externally very good. Internally was a mess, but externally was very good. Back to the whole me getting kicked out of the Protestant church. The externals of the Protestant church were great. The church itself was called Christ Care Church. We all made fun of the name change. It was South Carroll Full Gospel, but we all made fun of the name change. We're like, it sounds like a hospital. Anyway, but that was the thing, was it was supposed to be like a hospital. It was supposed to be this caring environment. Mm-hmm. But there were multiple of us young guys who were rebellious by nature. And guys tend to be rebellious. Like, thankfully, my rebellion was going into the Catholic Church. But which also, by the way, just want to throw a couple things out there. My two brothers, because I have 7 sisters, 2 brothers. My 2 brothers and my mom have all entered the Catholic Church. So,
wow,
very good.
Praise God.
Yep. Unfortunately, my father passed away, but my mom and 2 brothers are now part of the Catholic Church. So,
oh my gosh.
Yep, it was great. My wife and I, we were their sponsors this last Easter. So, yeah. But again, back to like the whole like appearance of like looking good and looking caring and stuff like that. I forget what the Bible verse exactly was, but one of the pastors at the church, because there was one pastor. It was a weird situation. There ended up being one pastor. There were like 5, and then they decided to end that council and just go with one. Which, real quick, what church has one pastor? Anyway, they ended up going with this one, and this one guy, he appeared very caring. He had this witness to the homeless out in the city, and it was interesting because he ended up taking this one verse out of context. And again, it was many years ago. I forget 14 years ago? Was it 14 years ago? Anyway, it was a long time ago. And he took this one verse out of context, and I approached him about it because I was like, this is wrong. Clearly this verse means this. It's like, clearly, when you read the whole context, this verse means this. He didn't take too kindly to that. And then he and a bunch of elders, that's what we called them, elders, sat me down in a room for about 2 hours and yelled at me.
Sounds like biblical fraternal correction. Just kidding.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I mean, I just approached him one-on-one. Because that was like the biblical way to do it, was approach him one-on-one. Be like, look, this is what this says. This is what you're saying. But I was a young 18-year-old and he was 60. And it was interesting because, again, like, he had this whole look about him of this care and compassion, but deep down underneath, he had no problem destroying a young 18-year-old. I'm glad he did, because if he hadn't done that, I never would have been open to the Catholic Church. I guarantee you I would not have been open to the Catholic Church.
Wow.
I was dead set against it. So I'm glad he did. At the time, it sucked. It was terrible. But I'm glad he did, because it allowed me to then actually start exploring what the Catholic Church actually was, and finding out that it actually is truly the Catholic Church.
Wow.
Yep. And honestly, it was a lot of the verses from Vatican I that actually brought me into, like, the understanding of the papacy. There's actually another verse about the papacy. Well, not about the papacy. It's in John's trial. Well, I forget what verse it is. But in when I say John's trial, I mean the trial of Jesus in the book of John, where it says the high priest did not say this of himself, but said it of God, because he was the high priest of the time.
Mm.
So for me, the whole idea of papal infallibility was like, so if it was true during the trial of Jesus that the high priest could speak beyond himself, why couldn't the high priest of the Catholic Church do it now? How much more couldn't the high priest of the Catholic Church do it now?
That's an angle I had never heard before. That's cool.
Yep, it was that. Honestly, it was that verse right there. These, like, just cemented it for me. But it was that angle right there that really brought me into understanding of the pontificate, because it was like, why can't Jesus establish the church? I truly believe Jesus is real. Why couldn't he do this? Why wouldn't he do this? If he did it then, why wouldn't he do it now?
Right.
I feel like I'm getting a little gone off a little bit of a rabbit trail. I'm sorry.
No, I think this is all good. Again, like you said, papacy is so foundational to this whole conversation, because, like, the Society of St. Pius X, they say that they acknowledge him in his office and that he has authority, but they remove themselves from having to obey that, because they judge that they know a better way than what he says. And then they try to redefine what schism is to fit, to not fit what they're doing, although the church's definition of schism exactly fits their behavior. But then the sedevacantists look at the Pope and they're like, well, we believe that there can be a Pope and that there's a chair, but we just don't think anybody's in it, and hasn't been since 1958 or whenever, depending on your group. And so, we're just kind of hanging out, waiting for things to be put right somehow, or Jesus is just going to come again and set us free from this strange situation. So it's like, wow. I mean, all of you guys are finding other ways around the papacy. You're not really just embracing it, which is Catholic tradition, is to embrace the establishment and the authority of the papacy and to follow it humbly. So it's like all these different variations are just different outfits, but it's the same thing underneath.
Yeah, and JP2's letter announcing the excommunication of Lefebvre, he said, what is traditional about, basically, I'm paraphrasing here, he said, what is traditional about rejecting the pontificate, the papacy?
Nothing.
Right. Nothing's traditional about that.
Right. It's only according to their own definition, but that's Protestant, because if you separate yourself from the authority, and even if you say we adhere to the scriptures, but then you have no one to interpret that for you besides yourself, and everybody's got a little different spin on it. Although we all read the same text and we all think, well, this clearly means X, but the person next to us says this clearly means Y. and there's nothing to bind us together. And so that's what happens with, you hear these trad apologists talking about this passage and that passage from different encyclicals or the documents of Vatican II and how they clearly contradict each other. And I'm like, only in your mind and some other people's mind, but really it's compared to how many people are happy to just follow the magisterium of the church. It's really a very small sector of people that are dissenting from this. And it's like, since when did that become okay to do within the church for magisterial documents? But you rail against the Protestants and tell people to avoid them. You can't pray with Protestants. You can't imitate the Protestants. You don't want to attend a liturgy that looks like what the Protestants are doing because they're so bad and so wrong. But you're doing the same thing, just with a different book, basically.
Yep. Yeah, it becomes solo tradition. I don't know. I think the Latin would be traditionis, but anyway. But it becomes sola tradition. And again, also, like, I could read a papal document from whenever, and say it means one thing. You could say it means something else. Just like I can read a verse from the Bible and you can say it means one thing, and I say it means something else. There is no there's no consistency, and without a rule, because you need the rule. Like, back to that Protestant church I was part of, they needed the one rule. Name one successful business that doesn't have a CEO.
Right.
You can't. Name one successful government that doesn't have a ruler. Right. You can't. Ideally, we could make the argument, like, since Israel was not supposed to have a king, Israel would have done that. But I mean, look at how many times Israel failed. They failed with a king. They failed without a king. They just failed. Sorry.
So sad. Oh man. Well, we keep making the same mistakes today, so yeah, it's just
yeah. Oh yeah, no, we absolutely are making the same mistakes. It's like we absolutely are making these same mistakes. I mean, that's a lot of why the Old Testament is in our scriptures, is so we can learn from these mistakes. We can learn, like, that we need to follow after God. We need to follow God first.
Yeah.
Period.
Right.
Like, another thing I've seen a lot from, like, traditionalists and evangelicals that's very, very, very similar, and it's very scary, is this whole idea of political affiliations. Like, I'm not saying there's anything necessarily wrong with being affiliated with something political, but being affiliated with a political organization does not make you more or less Catholic per se. There are some nuances, and there are some nuances, and there are policies on each party that Catholics cannot agree with. The question isn't about American politics as much as politics in general, because in American politics, and that's the context which we live, we see a lot of, like, this whole, like, evangelical support for candidate X and stuff like that, and we see traditionalist support for candidate X, but in the end, who is still reigning supreme? It's not. If we have another 4 years of our current president, is Jesus still king?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank goodness.
Yep. If we have 4 years of Trump, since he's running against him, is Jesus
make the non-essentials essential. Like, yes, when there's a
Mm-hmm.
moral conflict, you tackle those in order of priority because, like, life issues, those are non-negotiables. But
Mm-hmm.
then, yeah, again, it's like we're getting very narrow. It's very easy to be like, this is the course that I've chosen because it appears to be the best for all these reasons that I have. And maybe it's even more extreme than you really need to be to know you're on the right track, but you're just like, it's better to be way over here. And then after a while of being in that course, I know from experience, you start looking around at other people and you're like, well, why aren't the rest of you over here with me? This is the best place. And so then you start looking down on people who are even in the okay zone, and you're like, you're just not doing enough. It's just, I'm sorry. But if you were really sincere and really devout, really what you say you are, you'd be over here with me. And then you become the rule of faith, the rule of politics, the rule of whatever it is, lifestyle. It's just kind of, it's very a slippery slope.
Do you know what you just described?
What?
Evangelicalism.
Oh dear. Oh my gosh.
Yep.
It's so interesting to hear you comment on the externals, because I've never really heard that put forward before. Like that they actually emphasize their importance a lot too, and and they're willing to put pressure on manipulation, even abuse, to get a certain outward conformity that looks like, okay, good, you fall within these lines, so you must be okay, you're doing the right thing, on to the next, but failing to see what effect that's having on the heart and what it's setting people up for in the future, like kids who grow up despising religion and never having had a relationship with God because maybe they looked like they were doing everything they should have, but it never went into their heart because it couldn't, because their heart was like, it was too hurt. It was too neglected. So yeah, that's interesting insight.
Yeah. I'm not saying this to shame my siblings, but there are a good majority of us who have fallen away from practicing any kind of faith. Sort of. Some of them have gone into paganism. But yeah, it's definitely something I've definitely seen time and time again with evangelicals. Like I knew a family, and they were evangelical missionaries to Africa, and so they grew up in Africa. One of them's Catholic now, which he converted because of me. Sorry, but just a little excited about that.
That's cool.
Yeah, it is. It's actually really cool. But his sister is not, last I heard, it's been a while, but last I heard, is not practicing anything. And and it's like this, like, you literally grew up sharing the gospel in your life. Like, that was your whole life, was sharing the gospel, and yet you don't accept it.
Right. Something went wrong. Something so affected you that turned you off. So you need to step back completely from the practice of religion to kind of get your bearings again before you can even consider it. And like, I know people in that situation, and it's sad, but at the same time, I can't blame them, because it's like you're working with what you have. You're doing what you have to do. And God knows what's going on inside of you, and he's not holding you accountable for things that were out of your control. So he's gentle and patient. He's waiting for you to get to a place and a time where you can be, embrace that again. And so that it'll happen if they want it. If they really want the good, they'll be open to it when the opportunity comes.
I don't have any like firm document. This is just a personal belief of mine, that there are going to be a lot more agnostics in heaven than we care to admit, and a lot more Christians in hell than we care to admit. Like, again, it's just a personal, nothing, just personal. Like, that's honestly what I've seen, because it's like what St. Paul said is, like, don't desire to be a teacher because you'll be judged more harshly. And if you're teaching people and your teaching is leading them to hell, and it's in Ezekiel where he says the watchman is responsible for the blood of the people in the town.
Oh.
Yeah, these are all very serious things, and that's the biggest reason why I was okay coming onto this podcast, was because it's like I'm seeing these things, and if I'm not out here, if I'm not saying this, then the onus is on me for not speaking out against it. Because if you see something happening, Ezekiel's very clear that you need to warn the people.
Right. Again, yeah, that's why we're on here doing this. I'm so glad for your perspective too. And I think we need to be having more conversations with people like you who have a background in Protestantism and can say, this is what it's really like, and this is where you guys are going. Like, you can see the writing on the wall because you've been there already. So you don't have to be trad to know what it's like to be trad, because you're like, oh, I already was, and now I'm actually Catholic.
Yeah. And just real quick on the whole, if there are any people who are in the SSPX or are thinking about coming to the Novus Ordo or back into the full Catholic Church, well, I can't get exactly where they're coming from. I can understand like this whole idea of being raised that the Catholic Church is going to hell and that the Novus Ordo is evil. Like, this whole idea that the Mass is the Novus Ordo is a Protestant Mass, I can kind of see it a little. Yes, there are some very similar things in the Episcopals and Anglicans. There are some similarities between both of them. I can see that. I can see that there are some similarities, but it's not the similarities that make something Protestant. It is protesting against the Holy See that makes it Protestant.
So were the Catholics of the early church less Catholic than Catholics today because their liturgy was not the Tridentine Mass of Pope St. Pius V, because they weren't doing everything in Latin and they didn't have all the same trappings and ceremonies and genuflections and like that? That's kind of where it goes to. It's like, we're so developed and evolved, that now we can look down history and say, well, there's a reason why we're not doing that. And the people that are doing things that we used to do in the past are inferior to us. And so to bring that back, it's like spitting on the wisdom of your ancestors. It's like rejecting what you came from. And that is totally anti-tradition.
Yeah, but counterpoint to that, this whole rejecting where you came from, it's that's also, I've heard that as a counter argument as to why we should be keeping the Missal of 62, is because it's to remember where we came from. And I think there is some wisdom to that. I do. I think there's some wisdom to that. But it's not, it's not the Missal of 62 that saves us. It's not the Missal of 62 that brings us more fully into God's presence. What happened in 1962 that was like, did Christ come back in 62 and I just missed it? Like, what happened?
Right. No, like, it's true. It's a valuable part of our tradition, but it doesn't encompass everything from our tradition. And so it's okay to have additional expressions, just like the Eastern rites are additional unique expressions of our heritage that we have no business to look down on because they're not the Roman rite. as expressed for the last 500 years pre-Vatican II, like that was a good thing. And I'm not down on that liturgy, but what I am down on is how people are taking it and using it as like a battering ram for their ideology, because that's not, and you're going to ruin it for a lot of people. And you're actually kind of ruining it for the church because you're making it your banner of rebellion. And so what is the church going to have to do as this escalates? Well, she's going to have to suppress it, because this is where the problems are happening. And so in order to remove that environment from people, lest they fall into schism through it, she is right to take that away, because it's actually for the health of the body. It's like if you have a gangrenous limb, you cut it off. The limb was good, but it got sick, and it got so sick it was going to kill the body. So you have to cut it off. And the church isn't saying she's going to, cut people off. It's really, they cut themselves off if they go, because the church is always willing to heal. But some people, they're not interested in that. They're only interested in what they want, and they don't really care what the church has to tell them anymore. And that's such a shame to see.
Yeah. It's interesting because when we look at a lot of teachings about hell, it's not that God sends us to hell as much as we choose it. I can see the argument going either way. I think but that's tending to be the more current approach, is that we choose to go to hell. We are, so when we reject Vatican II, when we're rejecting the new Mass, we are choosing to reject the church Christ established. And it's this whole, again, it's not this, it's not this, are we getting kicked out, but rather, are we choosing to incur the disciplines upon us?
Right. Right.
Like, I heard somebody talking about Lefebvre, and he was saying how he was making the argument, to Lefebvre's credit, that JP2 did not personally excommunicate Lefebvre. I think there is some validity to his argument. But what's worse? Being told you're doing something wrong and choosing to do it anyway, or getting kicked out? There have been a couple different saints who have been excommunicated and then reinstituted into the church just because somebody was didn't like them, and so they were excommunicated because somebody didn't like them. But there's a big difference between choosing to do what's wrong,
right,
knowingly accepting excommunication upon yourself. I think that's worse, honestly. Because I honestly think that's worse than if he had been publicly excommunicated because he willingly chose to leave the church.
Right. Right.
I honestly think that's worse.
I think you're right. I mean, the kind of excommunication he incurred was the automatic, where you transgress this law, you take yourself out, just like you're saying. So the Pope didn't have to do it, if you will. It had to be declared, and it was. People say that wasn't a legitimate excommunication. They didn't follow the right procedure. They absolutely did. Everybody that needed to confirmed it in document form, and it was public knowledge, and so it was done, and it was just, it must have been such a sorrow for the Pope, because there was no need for it, especially because Lefebvre was going to get what he asked for. He was going to be given a bishop, but he doubted the church, and he withdrew his submission and his trust, and that took him right out. Bam.
I have a question. If Lefebvre is so great and Vatican II is so bad, why did Lefebvre sign all the documents?
You got me.
Yeah, I don't have an answer for you. I don't. I really don't. The only thing I saw in, I forget which video, there was some comments where someone was like, it honestly sounds like he had some mental break. Lefebvre did. And I have not studied his life enough to like analyze that. I'm not a psychologist, so I couldn't acknowledge it. But I think it's definitely something worth thinking about, worth considering. That he had a mental break. That I hate saying this, but it's like that's the most optimistic way I have of looking at him, is that he had a mental break, because that means there's a chance that he's in heaven because he wasn't culpable because he was mentally insane. That's literally the only, like, I'm sorry, but that's, I hate saying it, but that's like the most, it's just sad. It's just plain sad. And like seeing this repeat again and again and again, it's really sad.
Right.
And then some people will be like, but what about the German bishops? It's like, well, when we actually look at like what happened with Lefebvre, and like how there's a whole branch that broke off. When we look at what happened with the Eastern Orthodox, and that there's a whole branch that broke off, it's understandable that the Pope has been so
diplomatic.
Yes, yeah, that's the right word. Diplomatic with them. He's being a lot more diplomatic than I would be. I would not make a good Pope.
Don't you think there are some days though that he just wants to like grab somebody and just like shake him? He's like, I can't do that. Oh my gosh. Like, because imagine it's like Lefebvre, yes, he was one bishop, and look at the movement that's grown from his separation from the church. But then the German bishops are a whole conference of bishops in like a whole country. And like, I mean, that would be terrible. And so far in history, we don't really come back from schism. I mean, some of the smaller ones I think did get resolved. But the bigger ones, no. And that it's like, no, how can we avoid that? I think the Pope will do anything he can to keep them from just bolting, so that he doesn't want to be responsible for that. His job is to preserve unity. That's what he's doing. And it's not easy. So yeah, you can look at him and judge him all day long. And, but he is coming down on them. More recently, he's like,
yeah. There are these ideas like, there's a lot of talk that Pope Francis isn't coming down hard enough on these liberal bishops and these liberal ideas, but I think it was honestly he was playing the long game, because he went after the trads with Traditionis Custodes, because in his own word, well, again, slightly paraphrasing, but people were weaponizing the Missal 62. That's in his document to the bishops about Traditionis Custodes. I think it was very wise that he dealt with the traditionalists and then moved on to the liberals, because this way the liberals, I think it was a long game, because this way the liberals can't be like, well, these people are disrespecting you and you're not doing anything about it.
What a good mature response. That really addresses the argument in question. Well, what about that guy over there? Why didn't you spank him as hard as you spanked me?
Yeah, exactly. I honestly think it was a long game that he was playing to get us to the point where he could correct the German bishops.
That's a very interesting theory. Different thoughts about that out there that could be posited and they're not, because people just kind of want to jump to the conclusion of, how is the Pope not doing his job properly. I don't know. I
Yeah.
just, when people jump to these criticisms of the Pope and like,
Mhm.
or like saying, oh, well, Pope John Paul II didn't really excommunicate Lefebvre. I'm like, so you think he was that much of a bonehead that he didn't know how to do a simple thing like excommunicate somebody properly?
Or resign from the office?
Right. Like, yeah, Pope Benedict, he's still holding office. He didn't know how to do it right. It's like, wait, he was a genius until a minute ago, like a theological genius in your book. And now he's a bumbling idiot.
Mhm.
Like,
It's like,
no.
I mean,
Yeah, we could go on about this forever.
oh, yeah, we can. But yeah, I honestly do think there was a lot of wisdom in like what the Pope was doing, where he was first addressing like one set of abuses, and now he's addressing the second set, because they both needed to be dealt with, because both of them lead us away from the Catholic Church, and both of them lead us into, and that's what Satan wants. He wants us out of the Catholic Church.
Right. However, that has to be done. But the more attractive way, the more effective, because people don't want to go after something that's ugly and awful and obviously wrong. They're going to go for something that has an appearance of goodness. So,
and if we look at like the super traditional way of living, that's very attractive. It looks attractive. You have all the smells and bells and all of the everything. It's very attractive looking. When we look at like what the German bishops were trying to do, that Pope Francis just put an end to, of having like the laity help lead the church, that looks attractive. It does.
right.
Neither of them are right. We do need laity to be involved, not necessarily in governing the church. That is against canon law, but I'm gonna butcher this one too. But the decree of the apostolate of the laity, apostolicam actu istam. I don't speak Latin. But the decree on the apostolate of the laity, that in Vatican II, that was very, very good. That was very much like no, the laity do need to be involved. They do need to be doing this. But it was not being involved in the church. It was being involved in politics. And I know we talked earlier about how, not just politics, but daily life, helping to lead people into the church. And I know we talked earlier about like politics and the issues and pitfalls that can come with politics, of like putting this politician over and above the kingdom of Christ, because that's the issue. The issue isn't with politician X or politician Y. The issue is, are we putting the politicians over and above the kingdom of Christ? Because we are members of the kingdom of Christ first, members of whatever political organization you're part of second. Period. Any other reversal of that, that's
right.
Wrong. But it's saying we should be involved in politics. It's saying we should be involved in our everyday life, our daily life of like evangelizing to people, helping to bring people into the church. All of these different things. It's saying we should be part of all of that. Highly recommend reading that. I'm doing a very poor job.
No, you're fine.
Yeah,
I read it too.
Doing a poor job of describing it, but it's a really good document where it is talking all about this need for the laity to start doing more important things and start going into the world. And so then when we look at it like that, it's like we can understand where the German bishops are coming from with this whole idea of like, they're looking at this I don't know if they're looking at this document. They're looking at this kind of thing and being like, okay, we need more laity to do more things. And again, it's very attractive to like see this idea of you and I being important.
Right.
It looks great on paper. Unfortunately, that's not the way the Catholic Church works. Which, again, it's this whole idea of whose kingdom do we belong to? Do we belong to the kingdom of man or the kingdom of God? And when we recognize that we belong to the kingdom of God, we then have to recognize that Christ left us a vicar.
Right.
And that vicar is not just a vicar, but an authority, a supreme authority here on earth.
Right. I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your perspective and all the research that you did. And yeah, I think it's going to be really valuable for people to listen to what you had to say and take it in and just sort of look around with new eyes, because again, my grandfather used to say, you don't know what you don't know. So that's what we're seeking, perspectives that we can see things as they really are and not just as they were in our heads, in our little bubble, our limited experience of the world and the church. It really, there's a whole universal church out there, and we've barely been exposed to a sliver of it, any of us. So it's really important that we talk about this and look at where things are going. We didn't even get into purity culture. That's a whole other thing.
I will gladly get into purity culture.
Oh man, do you think we should do that, like a whole other video on that?
Probably. Probably.
Cool. All right. Well,
all right. But in the meantime, purity culture is bad. We'll leave it with that. Leave you hanging and leave you wanting more.
Oh my gosh, that's hilarious. Thank you so much, David. It was
Yeah,
great
of course.
having you.